Zhejiang, on China's southeastern coast, divided in two by a great river. One half, a land of rolling hills and mountains. The other, a twisting, rugged coastline dotted with islands. We'll begin our journey following a bridge over the sea, to islands full of memories waiting to be rediscovered. Then back over to explore a port that's been a gateway to the world for centuries. Hangzhou Bay Bridge spans an amazing 36 kilometers. Shortening the time it takes to drive from Ningbo to Shanghai from 4 hours to 2 hours. This mega bridge cost a cool 13 billion yuan to build. Dubbed the land between the sea and the sky, while the bridge was being built, the materials necessary for offshore operation were stacked here. Now tourism has given this tower a new lease of life. The ideal place, come for a spectacular view of the whole bay. This bridge should be in service for at least another 100 years. To make this possible, builders laid more than 5,000 steel pipe piles at the bottom of the sea. The longest one is as high as a 30-story building. Only 1/8 of its length is above the surface of the sea floor. Made up of more than 1,300 islands, the Zhojiang Islands is China's largest archipelago. Up until 10,000 years ago, this was all hills. That changed when the sea level rose, submerging the hills, all except the peaks, still visible above the surface, the Zhojiang Islands. Mount Putoa, the Zhojiang's Isle of legend and mystery. In 859, Japanese monk Hui came here. He was on his way back to Japan by boat, carrying a statue of Guanyin from Mount Wutai, when a storm forced him to make a landing in the Zhojiang Islands. Unable to go any further, he decided to leave the statue on the island. This statue of Guanyin, or Goddess of Mercy, made in 1997, comes to symbolize this island. Of all the 4 great bodhisattvas, Guanyin had the most followers. Legend has it that Guanyin lived in Potoraka, transliterated as Putoa in Zhejiang. Maybe Guanyin was just coming home. The Ningbo Zhoushan port is one of the few natural deep-water ports in China. The port began to thrive in the Tang Dynasty. It's a success story that has continued for the past 1,200 years. Two-fifths of China's petrochemicals and 1/3 of its iron ore pass through here. Cargoes from more than 600 ports from over 100 countries and regions are transferred here. In September, all fishing boats in Shupo Port are ready to go. It's the end of the off-season. After a gap of 4 months, It's time for the fishermen to return to the sea. That calls for a celebration. First things first. Time to fill up the boats with ice, ready for their first trip out to sea. With plenty of ice, the fishermen can keep their catch fresh until they're back in port. For many people, a glance at the crescent-shaped bay brings to mind a film that was shot here, Song of the Fisherman, the first Chinese movie to win a prize in an international film festival. It's always been the local custom for fishermen to offer sacrifices before putting to sea. In 1998, these rituals have developed into a major festival. The fishermen also believe that it's important to express their gratitude to Mother Nature. They do this by throwing any fish that look too young back into the sea. Nearly 3,000 fishing boats cross the Tonghuamen Bridge and head to Zhejiang Fishing Ground, the biggest traditional fishing ground in China. Now it's time to leave these beautiful islands in the East China Sea behind, to travel back across the sea and back in time, to an ancient city, to a landscape of paddy fields and rolling hills that has inspired some of the greatest landscape poems. When it reaches the Nanji Archipelago, the sediment carried by the river is almost spent. Da Shaao is a sandy beach with a difference. The soft white sand you find here is a gift from time and Mother Nature. Unlike other types of sand, this stuff is entirely made of shells. When shellfish in the sea die, their shells are washed and ground into powder by the waves. Eventually, there's enough of it to cover an entire beach. In Nanji Archipelago, the most valuable thing lies in the sea. South-flowing cold currents of water meet north-flowing warm currents here, making for conditions that suit a wide range of aquatic creatures. Here you'll find plants and animals typically found in very different climate zones, all in the same place. The Nanji Archipelago seabed is a paradise for shellfish and algae of all types, a genuine marine melting pot. Following the seabirds, we visit a yellow croaker farm in the Nanji Archipelago. Key to the success of this venture is the application of new technology. Fixed to the seabed at depths of more than 10 meters, the fish are kept safe, even in the fiercest typhoons. Once the immature fish, each weighing 100 grams, are put into the net cages, it's just a matter of time. A year later, the delicious yellow croakers will be ready. This is an ancient city that has wrestled with floods for nearly 1,000 years. These 198 steps lead to the existing 4,700-meter-long section of the ancient city wall. To reduce the impact of the Linjiang River floods, the city's barbican along the river was built into a semicircular structure. Even the bastion protruding from the outside face of the wall is curved, so as to give it greater protection against flooding. These watchtowers were designed by a Ming Dynasty general called Qi Ji Guang in the mid-16th century. They were built to protect against raids by Japanese pirates and were so successful that similar ones were later built on the Great Wall. As we go southward, we come to the Yandong Mountains. Movements in the Earth's crust millions of years ago established the basic outline of these mountains. Later, more complicated natural factors came into play, sculpting them more carefully, giving them the distinctive features which has made them famous. Here, beneath an ever-changing sea of clouds, cut off from the rest of the world by high mountains and fast-flowing rivers, is an idyllic land. So isolated that the people who came here to farm this land have evolved a unique, complicated dialect, very different from that which was spoken elsewhere in Wenzhou. Indeed, it's split into several sub-dialects, so different that the chances are when two people from different parts of Wenzhou meet, they'll not be able to understand each other. The Nanxi River is known for its 36 bends and 72 beaches. In 422, a new governor arrived here, one who had become disillusioned and frustrated with life as an official. So, inspired by the beautiful landscape here, he took solace in writing, pouring his frustration into some of the most beautiful landscape poems in Chinese literature. His name is Xie Lingyun, and not difficult to see what moved him to verse. This is Shuowei Rock on the banks of the Nanxi River. The 306-meter-tall light red rock is surrounded by 9 peaks. Seen from afar, it resembles a huge mast. It's tranquil here. This is a land of peace and quiet, an unsurpassed poetic landscape, and Xie Lingyun's verses are a peerless tribute to its enduring beauty. In Yongjia, an 800-meter-high mountain was reclaimed by the local people and transformed into terraces. These terraces have taken almost 1,000 years of hard work to create, turning barren mountainside into productive arable land. An amazing achievement. On the next leg of our journey, we're going to fly across a lake and then upstream on a quest for a taste of the olden days. From there, it's up and over the mountains once again to witness a titanic, elemental wrestling match. The sea versus the river. From up here, you really get a sense of the greatness of this river. The river has three well-known names. Its upper stretch is called the Xinan River. Its middle stretch is known as the Fuchuan River. And its lower stretch is called the Chentong River. Because of the meandering course of the river, ancient people named it the Zhejiang River, which means zigzagging river. It's because of the river that the whole province got its name. As it winds its way through the mountains, the Xinan River calms down by the time it reaches Chuanan County. The construction of the Xinan River hydropower station started in the 1950s. In terms of volume of water stored, this reservoir is 3,000 times bigger than Westlake. This is Chendao Lake, literally Thousand Island Lake, named because of its 1,078 islands. But there's more to this place than meets the eye. Under the water are two sunken, 1,000-year-old ancient cities. Environmental conditions are superb here, a fact much appreciated by the egrets who flock here. People living by the lake employ a fishing method found nowhere else: giant net fishing. Three kinds of giant nets divide the water into several parts, while the fishermen on the boat block, drive, and spear fish, so as to squeeze their living space. It's hard work, often taking several days. But it's worth it. The largest single haul these fishermen netted weighed in at more than 150,000 kilograms. After leaving the Chendao Lake, we fly to the east along the Xinan River, which meets the Lanzhong River at the foot of the Nanfeng Pagoda. The merging of the two rivers gives birth to a new one, the Fuchuan River. Immortalized by the mid-14th century painter Wang Gong, his masterpiece, Dwelling in the Fuchuan Mountains, took 4 years to complete. A vivid portrayal, this painter offers later viewers a real sense of how the Fuchuan River landscape looked back then. But this is not just the place that has inspired the flights of fancy of poets and painters. You really can fly here. Invented by a French mountaineer, paragliding originated in the 1970s. Failure is just the beginning. The ultimate target is to take to the skies. On the 18th day of the 8th lunar month, the banks of the Chentong River are crowded with people. They're waiting for the tidal surge. When water from the Chentong River meets the seawater of Hangzhou Bay, a thin white line appears on the horizon. Next, there's a surge of water from the sea, threatening to burst the banks and flood the land. The pressure on the seawall is immense, 7 tons per square meter. But the brave people who live here have always refused to be intimidated by the tides. Indeed, they've harnessed the elemental power of the sea for centuries, not just to secure a living, but also to have fun. Back in the day of the Southern Song Dynasty, there were so-called wind riders, sometimes known as tide players. 800 years later, it seems the Chentong River is still popular with their modern-day successors, surfers. In the next leg of our journey, we'll explore a city bursting with dynamism. Then, after we've voyaged into the depths of time, it will be time to go up into the air for a bird's-eye view of an exquisite tea garden. Next, we'll take in the old Japanese cedars in the Tianmu Mountains, experience the beauty of the lakes and rivers of the Hangzhou Plain, and finally watch a play or two in an ancient town. EU International Trade Center isn't famous for selling anything in particular. It's famous for selling lots of things, lots of little things. They might be tiny, but the businessmen who set up shop here know that lots of little things can translate into huge profits. Selling over 1.8 million trinkets, knickknacks, and goodness knows what else, EU does business with people from over 200 countries and regions of the world. In the run-up to Christmas, it's especially busy here. They say that Santa Claus lives at the North Pole. We can say for sure that all the little trinkets in his sack come from EU. White walls, gray tiles, fireproof horsehead walls, and courtyards that can gather rainwater and wealth. The secret of his seemingly ordinary village lies in the Zhongshu Pond in the center of the village. Half of the pond is land, while the other half is water. The whole pond looks like a yin and yang symbol. Centered on the pond, the layout of the village also resembles a sacred symbol. This is a close-knit community, most of the villagers bearing the surname Zhuge. The Lantern Festival is fast approaching. Tens of stools are connected end-to-end to form a dragon. Whoever gets the dragon's whisker will have good luck in the new year. The ceremony won't be over until the dragon has circled 3 times in front of the hall and then wound its way through the narrow alleyways of the village. Villagers here have been praying for peace and prosperity in the coming year, like this, for centuries now. Something these tourists also hope for as they light their wish lanterns and send them flying up into the night sky. Flying through the clouds and fog in the morning, we spy a masterpiece laid out on the ground below. A masterpiece in the tea bushes. Moist and warm, these mountains and hills provide the perfect environment for tea to flourish. It's only when you reach a height of 824 meters that you really begin to see 3 peaks clearly. They stood on Earth for about 135 million years. Complex geological movements have caused a 3-way split in the rock. It looks a bit like some giant has set about it with a huge axe. Between the steep cliffs is a narrow passage, at its narrowest point, only 3.5 meters wide. According to local legend, back in the Ming Dynasty, somebody tried to build a ladder reaching all the way to the top of these cliffs. It took 3 years, and they still hadn't reached the top. What's more, the wood at the bottom had all gone rotten. Not that a ladder is needed these days. In the late 1980s, local people chiseled 3,500 steps into the cliffs. Now people can climb all the way to the top via this steep staircase. "98% of the Tianmu Mountains are covered in forest. Dense forests that contain some fine old Japanese cedars. The Tianmu Mountains are one of the few places on Earth where you'll find Japanese cedar trees growing in the wild. The Tianmu Mountains boast the largest Japanese cedar forest. And some of the trees here are huge. The diameter at breast height of this Japanese cedar is over 2 meters. To get a good look at the treetops, the aircraft has had to fly 50 meters up in the air. Trees don't get to this size overnight. It's said that this tree is more than 1,000 years old. This majestic tree was dubbed King of Trees by none other than Qing Dynasty Emperor Qianlong himself. It was thought to have died as a result of dehydration in the 1930s. But in recent years, new branches have sprouted from its seemingly dead trunk. It looks like a successor to the title. A huge tree growing nearby will have to wait a bit longer before it takes the crown. Water is the real master of this piece of land. It's taken thousands of years for mankind to learn how to survive here. We need to fly higher to see this area of plain more clearly. Hangjiahu Plain has the densest network of rivers in China, surrounded by the Tianmu Mountains, Taihu Lake, and Shentong River. Farming fish in ponds dug in the depressions that dot this landscape is one way to make a living in this low-lying area. Mud dredged from rivers is spread around the ponds, ideal for growing mulberry trees. The mulberry trees are in fact part of an integrated, sustainable approach to aquaculture and agriculture. Planting mulberry trees around the ponds means they can use the mulberry leaves to feed silkworms, which in turn provide food for the fish. Even the waste produced by the fish plays a role, fertilizer for mulberry trees. With the help of the aircraft, we'll go to see what the bottom of the pond looks like. In recent years, villagers in Nanshun have set up solar panels above the pond. It's not just fish that can be harvested from these ponds. There's electrical power too. In October, the whole of Wuzhen turns into one big stage. That's because of the Wuzhen Theater Festival. It's only been going for a few years, a blink of an eye in the town's 1,300-year history. But it seems to be doing a great job at bringing together classical and modern art from both East and the West. As night falls, people come to the Wuzhen Grand Theater. More than 10 plays will be presented here. In the next leg of our journey, we'll explore the history of the province's northwest before retracing the footsteps of a famous Tang Dynasty poet. Everywhere you look in Shaoxing, you see stone bridges. "10,000 of them in Shaoxing alone, connecting not just the present-day people of the town, but also bridging time. On these bridges, you follow in the footsteps of people who lived here hundreds of years ago. Flying close to the water, we see the traces of old paths. In the past, cargo barges were hauled along these tow paths. There they still are, 1 meter wide, slate-paved tow paths, testament to the hard work of the men who hauled boats and barges here all those years ago. Ahead, a boat with a black awning, a reminder of a long-forgotten Shaoxing industry, quarrying. This is all that's left of a mountain. Bit by bit, generation after generation, the blue stone the mountain was made of was chiseled away. After 2,000 years, half the mountain had gone, leaving just this cliff. The 19 peaks, like a huge screen unfolding across eastern Zhejiang. This building is in a natural cave through the cliff. The people who built this had little understanding of the natural processes that result in phenomena like caves, so they invented stories to explain them. According to the local legend, this cave was dug by Yu the Great, famed for taming great floods, as a place to anchor his boat. Time to head for southeastern Zhejiang. This path might have been trodden by China's earliest pair of mountaineering footwear. They were worn by a very distinguished person indeed, Xie Lingyun, disillusioned official and brilliant landscape poet in the 5th century. Attaching 2 wooden spikes to each of his clogs, so the story goes, he found that it was much easier to get about when he was roving the hills in search of inspiration. So successful was his innovation that they were known as Xie clogs to later generations. But Xie Lingyun is famed more for his poetry than his contributions to footwear. It's because of his brilliant verses that the Tianmu Mountains became one of the favorite subjects for poets in the Tang Dynasty, the golden age of Chinese poetry. No lesser figure than Li Bai wrote poems about the summit of the Tianmu Mountains, how it juts into the sky, touching the very heavens. So powerfully was he affected by this peak that he even wrote about coming here in a dream. Now it's time to get our head out of the clouds and come down to the Tiantai Mountains, another sacred mount with a very special place in the hearts of the classical poets of the Tang Dynasty. The inspiration to literally hundreds of poems that have been handed down to us, just part of the golden treasury of verse that has been passed down to us from the Tang Dynasty. This place, Shuiliang Waterfall, was almost a place of pilgrimage for the Tang Dynasty poets, visited by almost all of them. With its amazing scenery and enchanting temples, it's not difficult to see why poets of China's literary golden age loved the Tiantai Mountains. Here they could forget the frustrations of the present, dream their dreams, let their souls soar like eagles over these enchanted mountains. Now for the final leg of our journey of discovery into Zhejiang. A journey that will take us across a mighty wetland, then up a venerable canal to enjoy the wonders of the world-famous West Lake, finishing up in an ancient city whose old-world charms are equally balanced by modern-day miracles. Located to the west of Hangzhou, the Shishi wetland, a low-lying area crisscrossed with rivers and streams. It's taken more than 1,000 years of natural evolution for this wetland to become what it is today. It's said that after escaping to the southern part of China, Emperor Gaozong of the Southern Song Dynasty decided he wanted to build his new capital here. Looking at the beautiful scenery here, it's not difficult to see why. It's not just water that flows into these lowlands. So too does time and history. After leaving Shishi, we make for northeastern Zhejiang. The covering of snow has made this a less colorful place. Time to move on, to journey up the Grand Canal, back in time to one of China's finest ancient cities, Hangzhou. The Beijing-Hangzhou Grand Canal is the longest man-made canal in the world. And it proved to be the making of Hangzhou, transforming it from an obscure town into a thriving city, a center of trade and commerce for the whole region. Linked to the rest of the country by the canal, Hangzhou boomed. Whatever the weather, whatever the season, Westlake always has its charms. It's also a place replete with story and legend. Several thousand years ago, so scientists say, the West Lake was connected to the sea. Over time, the Chentong River, flowing into the sea east of the lake, deposited vast quantities of sediment here, eventually separating West Lake from the sea. Inland, the West Lake was born. There are few places more romantic than West Lake. It's hard to find a spot here that doesn't have a story attached to it. This pagoda on the Zhejiang mountain is the famous Leifeng Pagoda. The legend of Shu Shen and Madame Whitesnake, one of China's 4 great folk tales, makes people like it even more. Because of this sad love story, the broken bridge in Hangzhou is no longer lonely. The high pagoda that looks over the broken bridge has been destroyed and rebuilt many times. Slender, touchingly vulnerable, and fragile looking, it's the Baochu Pagoda. As night falls, the West Lake covered in snow begins to glimmer into life, lit up by the colors of modern times. Leaving West Lake with all its ancient charms behind, it's time to get a taste of present-day Hangzhou. Since 2000, Hangzhou authorities have put more emphasis on developing the banks of the Chentong River. As a result of this policy shift, a brand new area has sprung on the banks of this ancient river, Zhenjiang Xincheng. a glittering, shining area whose skyline bursts into a brilliant light show every week. Proof, if any were needed, that thanks to its rapidly developing economy and commitment to new technology, Zhejiang's future looks set to be as bright as its brilliant past.